Before we start with the music,
Yes.
introduce yourself.
Oh, hi. I'm Tim Riley. I'm a Beatle author, rock history author, and I teach journalism at Emerson College.
So there's a conceit here where we're going to try and I'm going to play you different artists
Okay.
who are better than the Beatles.
Yeah.
And you're going to explain to me whether or not they are, and if they aren't, why not?
Yeah.
And we can talk about those artists. Well, first of all, who's the greatest artist of all time?
Oh, man. All time.
You could say the Beatles.
Well, no, I was thinking about this because your email last night, I was like, okay, I have to figure this out. I look at big history.
Yeah.
Right. So I don't know. Every day for me, it's different. But, so let's just say 20th century.
20th century.
I mean, you got to have Satchmo is going to be on your list. James Brown's got to be on that list. Jimi Hendrix has to be on that list. Do you notice how many black performers I'm putting on my list here?
Oh,
like they're all black.
so far.
Yeah. So it has to be that. And what I love about the music history experience is that the more you listen and the more you become aware of the larger picture, in my head, they all bounce off one another and relate to one another. And the dots that get connected in music history that's really the fun part. One of the things that fascinates me about the Beatles in 2026 is why are they still magical? It was a world historical thing, right? And you can still have that experience with the Beatles. So how does it travel through time? How is it still relevant?
You ready?
I'm ready.
You know what I'm going to play first?
No.
I wanted to start with like kind of an obvious comparison.
Oh, well, there's so many different directions to take this, right? This is the opening track of Let It Bleed. Is it the opening track or opening side 2?
I think it's the opening track. Let's find
Gimme
out.
Shelter by the Rolling Stones. And the Rolling Stones and the Beatles had a very friendly rivalry in the 60s, and they were competing for that top slot. And, there are critics who can make a very convincing argument that the Stones are the greatest rock and roll band of all time. That's an argument that is really fun to have between Beatles and Stones. What the Stones did that was so clever in retrospect was the Beatles saw rock and roll as a utopian project, right? It was roughly rock and roll can save the world. Rock and roll can make the world a better place. Rock and roll is a transformative energy. If you can capture it and you can participate in it, the world will be better. And you can hear that all through many Beatles songs, both explicitly and implicitly. And All You Need Is Love is like maybe the most explicit version of that. What the Stones did was they defined themselves in opposition to the Beatles. And so what Greil Marcus says is that the Beatles created a center and then the Stones went to the left. But they needed a center before they could create a left of center, right? And so the Stones exploit that left, that like, we're going to go dark. Like the Beatles are the positive ones, we're going to go dark. We're going to paint it black. And that is going to be our space, and we're going to cultivate that space. I mean, this record is like the ultimate proof that the 60s were not one thing. And there was a darkness, there was a chaos, there was a violence. There was a sense, especially in 68 with the assassinations and 69, that things were slipping out of control. The war was not going to stop. Some of it was harrowing. Yeah. So for all the idealism and stuff that the Beatles were expressing, there was this other, and the Stones were really capturing that, and the fear and the isolation and the non-attachment, the detachment.
So if they represented like the darker side,
yeah,
and the Beatles represented happiness and love and positivity, did the Stones win? Is rock and roll, like, is the broad picture of rock and roll a little bit more dark and sinister than what the Beatles tried to represent?
You're asking like big questions.
I don't know. Look at what happened afterward. Look at what happened into the 70s, 80s, today. Like, is rock and roll positive?
Right.
Or is it more
So I
dark?
like the way the younger generation comes along and says, okay, wait a second now. Gender is not a binary. And I think we need to use that thinking when we think of the music.
Yeah.
Okay, it's not a binary. It's not good versus evil. It's on a spectrum. Now, you can argue that rock and roll won because it became mainstream, and so mainstream now that it's difficult to teach students how subversive and radical it was at the time, and how rebellious it was.
Yeah.
I mean, it was, my parents were very concerned how much I loved rock and roll, and they were more liberal than most parents, but they were, they would hear me sing lyrics and they would be like, I don't know about that, So there's one way of arguing that rock and roll was massively successful and a victim of its own success because it got robbed of all its grit and substance and power to change. There is a way in which the Rolling Stones, like in their early 80s, prancing around the stage, are the ultimate symbols of that corruption. But the Stones would say, well, we were always in it for the money. You can tell they're pure musicians. That's all they care about. And there is something fascinating and intriguing about that, and also something kind of harrowing. And I mean, they left a trail of devastation in there. Their story is not pretty. So it's mixed. It's definitely mixed. And I think it's simplistic to say rock and roll won or rock and roll lost. I think there are qualities, you can argue both ways, but the more intelligent picture is that it's very, very mixed, right? We have a lot of things now that rock and roll made mainstream that would never have been mainstream without rock and roll. And we have a huge backlash from the right that is like against all that stuff and fighting really desperately against it, but trying to use rock and roll, like at right-wing rallies, they're playing rock and roll, or they're playing like YMCA, like tone deaf much.
So one more argument, possibly for the Rolling Stones is as a live band.
Yes,
are they better?
So
is Keith Richards a better guitarist than anyone?
Yeah, and again
in the Beatles,
and again, like
who puts on a better show?
Well,
the Beatles didn't have as much experience, obviously.
So there is a myth that the Beatles were never a great live band, and we have now a lot of proof that they were a great live band. Yes. And some of the best arguments about that have to do with they had no stage monitors, and they're still singing in tune. Or the rooftop performance of Let It Be, where there's no sweetening. They're playing direct to tape, and they go back and listen to the tape, and it's incredible.
Yeah.
And it shouldn't be incredible. It's maybe 40 degrees out there. I mean, the guitar should not be in tune.
So they're a victim of the technology, or the lack thereof, and the inability to sort of continue on late when the Stones were able to take advantage of.
So here's one way of looking at it. The Beatles really did get tired of playing concerts where no one was listening, because everyone was screaming too much, and they couldn't hear themselves. And even their last tour in 1966, they don't play any songs off Revolver. That's the direction they went off in, was we're going to harness the studio stuff. And they quit the stage and they go into the studio and they become these great studio musicians. And, it was a huge gamble, and everyone thought they were crazy. And the fact that they pulled that off winds up being very intimidating to every successive generation of rock and rollers. Like, can anybody create records that sound this good? And so we see a surge and a proving ground develop on the live stages, which is where people assume that, we can prove ourselves there. We don't, it's sort of like, these guys are too good in the studio. We're not even going to try to compete with them. We're going to prove ourselves on the stage. I think there's a good argument that that's how the Stones started looking at things. Yeah. And I think they gave great shows. And the best Stones, for me, the peak Stones live stuff is Mick Taylor, 1972. Like, all the shows that we have on bootlegs from that era are kind of astonishingly great. And they shouldn't be, because they're as deep into the dark hole as you can possibly get with their lifestyle, but for whatever reason, the gods are smiling on them. And so we see the Stones kind of surge and peak after the Beatles. And they sort of stake their whole fortune on that live experience. Now, that's not to say they don't make great records. They do make great records, but a bigger portion of our understanding of the Stones' greatness is about the stage.
Yeah. So the Beatles win against the Stones because the Stones almost don't exist in the same way if it's not for the Beatles.
Well, look, the Stones make some great records. They both have very different career arcs, all right? Very different career arcs.
You're not picking a side.
No, I'm not. I'm a Beatles guy. I'm a Beatles guy. But I have deep effect. I listen to the Stones a lot. The Stones playing Chuck Berry, some of my favorites. Stones on the BBC is like, God, that's such a great record. Oh my God. Yeah, I like to, it's big picture for me.
Okay. So let's go to another artist who comes before the Beatles.
How many roads must a man walk down before
Gotta get a prop for this one.
you call him a man? How many seas must the white dove sail?
So it's interesting you note that he's before the Beatles, which he is. A hard thing to teach to younger generations is this was not a hit. This is probably his best known song, but this was not a hit. The hit was Peter, Paul, and Mary.
Yeah.
How many times must the cannonballs fly before they're forever banned?
Softened it up and gave it some very pop colors. It's very hard to describe to younger listeners how strange that voice was when we first heard it. And it was so strange that people immediately jumped to this rationalization, oh, this guy can't sing. So when I was young and Dylan came on the radio, I would say, I got to have that record. I got to have that record. And my mom said, oh, he can't sing. What are you talking about? I'm not going to get you that record. He can't sing. And my thought was, I couldn't articulate it at the time, but my thought was, if you can't hear it, there's no way I can explain it to you. Like, it's just, I don't know. For me, it's like, that is so individual and so peculiar and so deeply felt that there's no better way for that song to exist than through that guy's voice. Like, the voice is an important channel for that material. I don't want to separate, like, we think of Dylan's version of his songs as the ideal versions of those songs. Everyone covers Dylan. Everyone is thinking of Dylan in their heads when they're singing it, because his version of it is usually pretty, I don't want to say definitive, like there can't be any other versions, but it's really powerful. And then Dylan goes and starts singing it differently every time he sings it, and then it's just like, it just becomes chaos in a really fun way, right? So what is the definitive version of this Dylan song? You know, there's this wonderful stillness he captures in that early version on Freewheelin'. It's really kind of modest. You know, it's an overrated song. You know, David Von Ronk heard this song and said, it's really not a very good song, Bobby. Dylan was like, what do I make of this? Like this, it is like a Hallmark card. You know, it's very superficial. It is not, it got picked up because in the civil rights era, the people were really wrestling with big questions, and this song seemed to point at that. But he has many better songs, sharper, more cutting, more vitriolic. This song is lighter. Mm-hmm. It's not, and I wouldn't say it's representative, right? In a very interesting way. Sometimes, you know, as a songwriter, like your most famous song is not very representative. It just becomes like this very popular thing because it's not something you can control. Which songs are people gonna get drawn to?
This is the most streamed, listened to song. It's the top of his, when you go on Spotify or Apple Music, it's up there. So I picked that one sort of for that reason.
So what we hear when we hear him sing Blowin' in the Wind alone on his guitar, you know, at the time we didn't hear rock and roll, but now we hear, oh, that's a rock and roll voice, because he went and did some of the great rock and roll a couple of years later. But at the time, we didn't hear it as pointing towards rock and roll. And Dylan's genius was, hey, this stuff all flows right into rock and roll. Like, don't limit yourself. Don't just listen to folk music. Listen to everything. And only by listening to everything are you going to be able to make sense of anything. And we now appreciate that vocal and also that harmonica, which is kind of wayward and strange. And it's like he's looking at you crooked or something, like, what is going on? And now we hear that harmonica as a lead guitar.
Why change from folk to rock and roll? Like, what is that? Is that something that he always aspired to do?
It is.
Or was it the times changed and he changed with the times?
A little bit of all of that, but we know he was a big rock and roll fan from early on, big Little Richard fan. There's a passage in his book where he goes to see Buddy Holly a few nights before Buddy Holly dies, and he says that they lock eyes. I mean, it's really fun to think about Bob Dylan, the teenager, locking eyes with Buddy Holly, but it's also the Beatles. I mean, the Beatles have this extraordinary energy that begins to circulate even among folkies. And Dylan is very hip to the Beatles early on. Like the folkies are like, oh, that's teeny bopper stuff. And Dylan is like, no, their chords are great. They have great chords. Like these guys are doing. And then, and they have this famous meeting, and it's very clear they heavily influence him. We talk much more about how Dylan influences the Beatles, which is true. But the Beatles' influence on Dylan is cannot be overstated. And his big leap to rock and roll is masterful and ingenious and deeply creative and innovative, because he's not trying to sound black either. And he's not trying to sound like the Beatles or anybody else. He just has his own sound. And he understands that the rock and roll ethic is to just like dig deep into that individuality, into that idiosyncrasy, idiosyncratic quality.
So if there is no Beatles,
Yeah.
is Dylan the same person? Do we think of him the same way, or does he never make the leap is he just the one note?
These are just great questions because honestly, you can't really understand any of these figures' greatness unless you understand the larger context, right? So we are all thinking about Dylan in the context of the Stones and the Beatles, right? That is the great rock and roll trifecta, and they all help us make sense of each of them by how they react to each other. The mystery is they're not imitative. They're very self-aware, they're very self-conscious, they're listening to each other like crazy. You can sense this coming off of their records, but they all just follow their own individual creative path without stooping to imitation.
And what's this?
Yeah. So that's Hard Rain. That's my second book, a Dylan commentary. And I think the first sentence of that book is about how, people mishear Dylan's voice.
Bob Dylan's voice can crook emotion the way a prism refracts light.
Right. So his voice is prismatic, right? And it's fascinating because every time you listen to it, you hear a different color coming through. It's a very different way of capturing a lyric than almost any other singer, which is, I'm going to sing this in such a strange way, it's not going to make sense, maybe for the first 10 listens. And then when it enters your bloodstream, you are going to be able to say, oh, no, half of the poetry of this verse is in the delivery, because the delivery is so strange, and it crooks, it bends what the words are doing into a new direction. So there's nothing simple about any Dylan delivery.
Is that true of John Lennon?
Yeah, it is in a subtler way than, like you'd hate to get into a debate about who's a better singer, John Lennon and you were bringing up Keith Richards. Like, I think John Lennon is a masterly rhythm guitarist. Mm-hmm. And everyone talks about Keith Richards as the great one. And he is. Keith Richards is great, but Lennon is underrated as a rhythm guitarist. Listen to the drive behind I Want to Hold Your Hand, or You Can't Do That. Oh my God, the rhythm guitar on those things. And I have this theory that he was playing a 3/4 neck guitar because it made it easier to get around. And he was doing so much and pumping so hard that he actually enjoyed that shorter neck guitar. Rickenbacker.
His voice changes too, from like he sort of like how you're talking a little bit about.
Yeah, so there's a great thesis paper that has yet to be written on, let's talk about Dylan's vocal delivery influence on John Lennon, right? That would really make a fascinating subject, because you know it's happening. You can sense that is true, but what are the particulars there what are the details that would support that argument? Yeah.
Is there a Beatles song that I should play that we can think of where John is channeling Dylan a little?
Yeah, I would say Norwegian would be the one.
I once had a girl, or should I say, she once had me. She showed me her room, isn't it good? Norwegian.
it's a fascinating duet, too, because McCartney is back there. Mm-hmm. So there's these wonderful Lennon songs where McCartney kind of shadows, and it's a duet, but like we don't think McCartney. It's so funny. It's just the color there. It's beautiful, but it's actually a duet, right? And he does this in Don't Let Me Down. Like everyone's Don't Let Me Down. That sounds like a solo Lennon. No, there's a McCartney harmony in there that is absolutely gorgeous. So part of what Lennon is doing here is he's playing his cards very close to his vest, like Dylan, both his delivery and his lyric, where he has an encounter with a lover, and it's deeply mysterious to him, and he makes it very mysterious to us. And so immediately our head fills up with questions like, what happened? Who jilted who? There's one way of reading it that is, she got up and left, and like he felt jilted, right? He felt like that was the cold shoulder. And that maybe there was this theory going around that, so I lit the fire, isn't it good Norwegian wood? So that maybe he just sets fire to her place. Or is he just like lighting the fire and reminiscing, oh, we had such a nice night last night, and now I'm alone and I feel like jilted. So there's the literal, the surface meaning, and then there's all these other like questions emanating from the text and the delivery, and you don't really know, right? And Dylan is really great at that, at evoking those kinds of mysteries around encounters like that. And I think that's kind of what Lennon is learning here. Now, it's not that he never did that before or that, he needed that cue or whatever, but I do think you can hear that influence there.
Next, I'm going to play a band who the Beatles were famously envious of when this came out.
I'm waiting for the day when you can love again. I've kissed your lips when your face looks sad.
I'm glad we got these speakers.
It's very, very, it's really interesting because he was deaf in one ear, so he's mixed everything in mono, but it's the clarity, the precision is really, really breathtaking. Even now, it's like, oh, that would be so hard to do now, to get so much instrumentation and have it all be just like, oh, I can hear the flute, I can hear the bass, I can hear the this, I can hear everything is very clearly etched into the mix. It's really extraordinary.
So what happened when this came out?
So Brian drops off touring. He says, I'm not going to tour anymore. I'm just going to work in the studio. And so that's actually, he is an inspiration for the Beatles to do that, right? And Bruce Johnston, I think is his name, he takes an acetate of Pet Sounds over to the Beatles to hear in the summer of 1965. And I think they're filming Help. I'll get some of the details wrong, but they're in a hotel room. And the idea that this American rock and roll group goes to London to get the blessing of the rock and roll gods, like that would not have happened even 4 years earlier, right? So the center of power has shifted. The Beach Boys are looking for the Beatles' blessing, right? That's how big the Beatles are. And they play it, and the story that I know goes, they asked them to play it again, so they played it again, and then John and Paul go over to the piano and they talk a little bit and play a couple different passages to each other, kind of secretly over at the piano alone. And then they thank them very nicely. Oh, this is great. Thanks for singing. And then they go off. Now, we know later from Paul McCartney that he's terrifically intimidated by this record. And he says this is the record that inspired Sgt. Pepper. Like they had to outdo this. They had to outdo Pet Sounds. They felt like there was another friendly rivalry. Like they were busy like, oh, they're going to one-up us here. We're going to have to be a cut above next time. We're going to have to compete with that. So that's definitely the way they heard it, and it's a very important record for that reason, aesthetically. But it's a tragic story because Capitol doesn't know what it has, and it kind of fumbles the record in America. It's a top 40 hit in the UK, I think. Look it up. I think it does make the charts in the UK, but it doesn't really score very high in America. And of course, it bums the shit out of Brian Wilson. And because he's not an active touring member of the band and they can't promote it the way it deserves to be promoted. And Capitol Records is kind of like, this is strange. Like, we want just the same old thing from you guys. Yeah. What are you doing? It's not a big hit. And everybody in rock and roll knows that it's a giant creative breakthrough and deserves to be on everybody's list. And it is It is a deeply beguiling, compelling, rich, extraordinary piece of production and melody and singing and arranging and everything. And, you know, it's just a sad, sad story because it kind of breaks Wilson's momentum. And you can tell that he's on a tear. He's gonna conquer the world. He could, like, if he could make 3 or 4 more Pet Sounds, he would. But the reaction within his own band and with his record label, it's not what he expects, and it's not. In a weird way, it's like getting the Beatles' blessing isn't quite enough. You know, it's a sad story. Plus, he has a chemical imbalance that's quite profound and that he's really starting to struggle with.
This idea of quitting touring and just focusing on making records is something that you probably couldn't do today. A lot of artists make the majority of their money from playing live shows versus putting out records. Was that the same back then? Like, did the Beach Boys make a lot of money from their tour? Or did most of it come from selling records and radio and all that stuff?
The history of music,
and the Beatles as well.
In the history of music, most people make most of their money by performing. The record companies have always committed fraud by withholding royalties and cooking their books. And I talked to a mid-level artist a few years ago, and I said, "Have you sued your record company yet?" And this artist said, "Oh, no, I wouldn't. Like, that's just for the big, like, just the Beatles and the Stones do that. Like, I wouldn't do that." And I think that's just really naive. Like, if your biggest artists are suing you, that means they're screwing everybody. Yeah. And they have been doing that for generations. And they're, especially with black artists, right? Mm-hmm. And then we have people like Bonnie Raitt who have made it their mission to try and win back royalties for these black artists. So the white artists don't get screwed as bad, but everybody's cooked the books and everybody should sue for back royalties. That was the big Alan Klein pitch that he brought the Beatles was.
No matter what, I'm going to get you money.
Right.
I get everybody money.
Right. And he knew how to get leverage on it because he could go into the books and he could find all these discrepancies. It wasn't rocket science. They were kind of open about it. They're probably much less open about it now. But it's like Hollywood. They're going to get you every which way they can. So in the live performance, there are just fewer middlemen. So it's a much easier transaction to track and sort of say, okay, ticket sales were X. This is my cut. This is your cut. And one of the McCartney quotes in the early 70s is about, it was really fun to just sit down and count the money after the shows. Like, I'd never had that direct contact with the payout, and there was something very satisfying about that. For the big guys, it's always very remote, and there's many accountants to talk to, and they used to call them suits. These are the suits. What are the suits doing? What are the bean counters? They're busy doing their bean counting again, and it's never good when they're doing that.
So Pet Sounds ranks among the best of the Beatles albums, but the Beach Boys just don't have the longevity and the ability to reproduce that creative peak.
And the other thing that critics think about when we weigh these things is consistency.
Yeah.
So early Beach Boys records can be very charming and a lot of fun, but there's also a lot of dross on them. They're not as consistent as Beatle records or even Stones records. So that's another thing that counts against them. And Wilson is a standout, but they have some political tensions in the band that are very difficult to resolve. Mike Love is a big problem in that band.
Okay. We're going to go back a little further.
All right,
and
good.
we're going to change genres.
All right.
So I'm curious to hear how you even start to think about comparing these.
Yeah, so this is a weak spot of mine, but this is Miles Davis. I think it's kind of blue. Is that right? Okay. And jazz is something that I work on very, very hard, and I have deep respect and deep admiration for jazz. Uh-huh. It's not really my go-to.
Yep.
But I've been working on Miles a lot, and there's certain Miles that I really, really swear by, and I love late 60s, early 70s Miles where he veers into rock and roll. I love all that stuff. The Jack Johnson, that for me is like, that hits me where I live. But the jazz is, so I like the way John Lennon looked at jazz, which he had great disdain for jazz. Why? Because the jazz people always lorded over the rock and roll people as, oh, we're much better musicians than you. And we make much more interesting, sophisticated music, more complicated, more challenging. And you guys are just out there playing 3 chords and screaming, and it's just really pretty pathetic.
Yeah.
Right? So the jazzers' disdain for rock and roll really rubbed Lennon wrong, so he just went right back at them. And he hated jazz. I mean, he would give quotes about how disdainful he was of jazz, but you could tell he respected it because he's using a lot of the same things. So the way that that song opens, the way it creeps in before you get the main melody, that's called a misdirection, right? And it's kind of a slow reveal. Oh, it hasn't started yet. Rock and roll does a lot of that. Rock and roll does a lot of like, oh, the first 16 bars we're going to slip into this, but we're not going to be pointing it out to you how we're going. We're going to misdirect you, right? Beatles did a lot of that in really interesting ways. So they use jazz techniques, and I think they're listening to jazz. I don't think they're obsessed with jazz, but I think there's a big jazz. It's important to respect the jazz that's going on at the same time. And I think Coltrane, one of the great essays that I should write. I should sit down. I should do the work. But I think rock and roll has
a big effect
on. It happens a lot. I think the big essay is rock and roll's effect on John Coltrane, because everyone talks about sheets of noise, and his very abstract work. And I think that you hear him blow his whole body through that horn. In some of that great stuff, and I think it's very rock and rolly. I think there's a lot of rock and roll in there. A friend and I used to say, yeah, jazz is a scam. It's just all a scam. And what we meant by that was, there's a lot of weak, mediocre jazz. And there's a way in which people used to say to us rock and rollers, like, you'll learn to appreciate jazz. Once you get older, you'll develop the ear for jazz. And we used to hate it when they said that because it was so patronizing.
Yeah.
And it was like, I Want to Hold Your Hand is as good as it gets.
Yeah.
On anything. So don't be snobbish about She Loves You or I Want to Hold Your Hand or The Last Time or You Go Your Way, I'll Go Mine. Those are great, great pieces of music. They don't need anything. In fact, their lack of sophistication is part of what makes them great. Like, that's part of where the rock and roll value set is. It's about simplicity. It's about just the core essence of things instead of these giant elaborations on things. Now, I'm not going to say rock is better than jazz, but taste is really interesting. Taste is kind of inexplicable.
Yeah.
Right? Like, whatever floats your boat. Like, the variety and the choice, that's the point.
Yeah.
Go to where the stories are talking to you.
Before bebop started, jazz was the rock and roll of the time period, right? The big bands, Duke Ellington, teenagers would see jazz and dance and party.
Yeah, I would say the flaw in that argument is it wasn't youth oriented. Okay, so Duke Ellington is playing as much for adults as he is for the younger set. Now, jazz did have that rebellious energy, and it was transgressive, and it was deeply sensual in ways that pop was like, we're going to smooth that over. We're not going to be as explicit as those jazz guys are about sex. But what rock and roll's breakthrough and rock and roll's, big explosive moment in Elvis Presley is it's all about
targeting
youth.
Teenagers.
It's about youth.
Yeah.
It's music for and by teenagers. So I'm going to tell you a story that crystallizes this because it is a way in which we look at the past we smudge over that a little bit. So when I started teaching at Emerson, they gave away copies of my Beatle book, but Tell Me Why, to the freshman class as a junket of some kind of treat or whatever. So I had kids coming into my office and saying, oh, can you sign my book? My mom is the biggest Beatle fan. Oh, will you sign my book? My dad's name is Doug, and he's the biggest Beatle fan there ever was, right? And then someone walks in and says, will you sign my Beatle book? My grandmother is the biggest Beatle fan. And that gets laughs from people over 30 and 40. But when I tell that to my college students, they don't get the joke.
Yeah.
But the joke is, No, it's youth music. Everyone who was there understood it as youth music. This is how we define ourselves against our parents, as different than our parents, right? That was not going on with Duke Ellington so much. There was not that. There was the big binary in the 60s was over 30, under 30, right? Don't trust anyone over 30. And the older generation was the establishment, and we were bucking the establishment. We were giving it to the man. That's what the younger generation was. We're going to build a new world. We don't want this world that we're inheriting. We refuse to accept all of these assumptions about politics, about music, about sex, about lifestyle, about none of that. We reject all of that. We're going to invent our own. That's the big rock and roll story. Jazz was doing it more in aesthetic terms, and also jazz had it had a window of popularity in the 40s with big bands, and it was very short-lived. So it went, I won't say it went underground, but it became a marginal music much more quickly, where rock and roll had a lot more staying power. And we fall into these traps as listeners that, oh, this is really popular, so it must not be very good. Yeah. And the Beatles kind of blast that one wide open, right? Because there is this self-awareness that the Beatles are perhaps the best musicians working, and they're also the most popular. So they're the most deserving. That's a really wonderful thing when that happens. And it doesn't happen that often in pop culture. A lot of time pop culture is dominated by stuff that's not so good. But the reverse is true too. Just because something is obscure does not make it great. Just because it's out of print doesn't mean it's this long-lost masterpiece that never got the attention it deserved. There's a lot of stuff like that that's bad too. You can't use the popularity as your measure of what's aesthetically good. This is what critics do. Let's distinguish between what's popular and what's good and bad. And the popularity can have something to do with it, but it's not going to be defining.
Perhaps the most important thing about the Beatles is the fact that they did both at the same time.
Right.
And that's why they...
Well, but, people don't talk about they had their ups and downs, too. I mean, the second half of 67 is pretty weak. It's substandard Beatle material. They've made Pepper and Penny Lane and Strawberry Fields and All You Need Is Love, and then they go off and do Magical Mystery Tour. It's a disaster. And people forget, they had a dip. And the dip helps us understand what's great, right? But you don't want to say Baby You're a Rich Man is on the same level as Hey Jude. I mean, seriously, there's fans who don't want to make these distinctions. Critics love these distinctions. I think it helps me appreciate it more. But it's not for everybody. And criticism is widely misregarded as there's something you should pay attention to. It's well, if it helps, pay attention to it. But it's not for everybody.
You want to hear a Beatles cover?
Oh, yeah.
So, did they have any relationship? Did they interact with each other?
I don't know if they had any direct interaction, but there was a musical conversation that went on between people like Stevie Wonder and Ray Charles and Aretha Franklin, and performing Beatles songs. And the Beatles are deeply, deeply humbled by this, and they love all of those soul renditions of these songs.
Completely different.
Different. I'm thinking, she sort of does away with all his fancy chords. It's not about the fancy chords. And McCartney loves I've got all these fancy chords in here, and she's like, no, that's not where the song is. The song is underneath that. It strikes me. I love her version of Let It Be too. I have not heard this in a long, long time. Her Let It Be is also really great.
Let it be, let it be, let it be.
I would say it's a contender for a cover that actually outdoes the Beatles' own version of it. Now, you can get into the argument about Phil Spector's strings, and I prefer the version without strings, but I don't really think the strings damage the song that much. I think Paul McCartney really overreacts to that, and he writes a famous letter, but he's just being Paul McCartney. He's not upset about the female chorus on Across the Universe.
Yeah.
And I would say, I would probably I like this version better than McCartney's version. Now, McCartney's version is, it's a great vocal. It's It's a second-rate song in my mind. It's not one of his great songs. It's very sentimental, but it's, he does strike that balance between really sentimental and just enough goop. But there are critics who are like, no, McCartney, like he's the flaw in the Beatles because he's too goopy, he's too sentimental, and he drags them too much in that direction.
Yeah.
And there's some serious critics I really respect who really like argue that. I don't really feel that way because there's too much of the stuff that I think really works. But there is this ethic, this purest ethic of rock and roll. No, it has to be tough and biting and cutting and gnarly all the time. And the minute you start, so Lester Bangs famously calls Paul McCartney a librarian. And he means it as an insult. He means it as like, you're too straight-laced. Like, even though you can sing Little Richard, like this McCartney has this kind of strange virtuosity in several different realms, but he's way too, especially on the solo stuff. It's just the sentimentality is really out of control, right? But with the Beatles, the sentimentality
comes by it honestly, though, right? Well, this is how what he grew up, like listening to, and
his DNA has this like, I'm a showman, and I'm going to sing a real syrupy love song, and there's going to be way too much syrup, and you're going to like it. It's like, no, actually, I don't like that much syrup. Enough. That's good for 2 tracks an album, but the whole album of syrup that's too much. But there's people I respect who really will defend all of McCartney. It's not for me.
Well said. We haven't listened to any country music yet.
If I should stay, I would only be in your way.
It's interesting how what I first heard was I thought, oh yeah, I don't really know this track. It sounds like Iris DeMent to me. Very interesting, but it's Dolly. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Dolly's original. So this is an example of a black person who covers a white song. Whitney Houston covers this for the Bodyguard soundtrack, and it becomes the biggest hit ever. Mm-hmm. And it's a travesty. It's like, oh my God, please never play the Whitney Houston version of that song for me. It's oversung, it's overwrought, it's goopy to the max. It's like Paul McCartney produced that. It's just out of control. It's just too much. And it's the biggest.
With the vocals, though.
Well, look, so you come away from those Whitney. Look,
it's like if you have the fastest sports car in the world, you got to put the pedal to the metal and get on the track and drive it as fast as it can go.
Yeah, so fine. So, okay, that's fine. Whitney's a sports car. I love it. That's good.
Her voice.
Yeah, no, but give me How Will I Know. Give me that. Yeah. Give me How Will I Know. I love that.
It's so fun.
I love that song, and the production is great, and that first album is a great moment. Again, so there's talent, and then how you use your talent, and then there's popularity and how that popularity affects the person. How can they handle it? One of the great themes, Beatle themes, really is their ambivalence about fame. And they sing about it and they write them and they're like, this is not really real. This is really this is a fabrication. This is an illusion. This is a mirage. It's not really about who we are as people. The Beatles have a much deeper understanding of that. Different people start to believe their own press releases, and it's a problem. It's deeply disorienting, and it can be mentally destabilizing. And the industry's not really known for clean living. So, Whitney's another sad story. No, it's a great voice. It's a Cadillac voice.
So, back to the Dolly version.
Dolly, yes.
And country music, in general. How do you feel about country music?
So, I'm a deep loving country man. Yeah. I love country. My friend Jimmy Gutterman and I used to talk about how if you're a big enough rock fan, there's 2 paths to go on. One is the blues and one is country. Uh-huh. And he definitely went down blues more than I did. But although I've been more now than I was then, but I went into country. So I just fell in love with Hank Williams and Lefty Frizzell. And, we had a cat named Lefty. Forget about it. Lefty Frizzell for me is like the man. And I love country, and there's a lot of rock and roll themes that you can hear traversing through country music that comes alive in rock and roll. It's just sitting there, and it's all in country music. And we misperceive a lot of country music history as being, we paint them all with a very broad brush. And there's a lot of variety and a lot of really interesting feminist statements in older country music. And again, it's not simple. It's not, once you get past the surface orientation of it, there's just a rich body of work there that's really great. I love country music. And Dolly is a force for good. I mean, she's like Oprah of country, right? She's very popular, and everyone knows. And she's a great writer. She's a great singer. Listen to some of Dolly's bluegrass stuff. That stuff is just divine. I think we underestimate country, and country's not country anymore. I mean, country's now like rock and roll. I mean, it's got really heavy drums and really loud guitars, and it's really changed a lot. And I'm not like, I like a lot of current country, but I like the older stuff.
Yeah. There's a melancholy in that era of country music that I think is very hard to find anywhere else. There's a deep sort of sadness.
Yeah.
That I think that's one area maybe where they got the Beatles beat.
I'm of a generation where Elvis Costello really turned me on to country. So his Almost Blue record, which critics panned and said, oh, go listen to the originals. It's like, well, duh, yes, I'm going to go listen. Yes, of course, I'll go listen to the originals. I still love that record. I mean, there's a great, and his song choices on that record, it's all like, this is where I get my material. This is where I get my song ideas. It's all about resentment and monogamy and inebriation and like accepting life's limitations. Like those are all very big Elvis Costello themes. And what he did for country music for me was he connected some dots that I just hadn't heard before. And yes, I go listen to the original Merle. I'm a huge Merle fan. I have a favorite joke for you. You can steal this. It's such a great joke. But Jimmy Gutterman went to interview Buck Owens when his box set came out. And he sat down with Buck Owens and said, so, Hank or Lefty? And Buck Owens said, Merle. It's just my favorite joke because all country people are Hank or Lefty. It's like Beatles and Stones, right? Yeah. You're in one camp or the other, which is already is just like, when you put it like that, it's like, yeah, that's ridiculous. Yeah. I want both camps. But Hank or Lefty, and I'm definitely a Lefty guy, but I love Hank. Of course you love Hank. Hank is sublime. Lefty is more clownish. He's more humorous. He's more of a like, I'm a jerk and let's just have fun. You're always late with your kisses. Oh my God.
Always late with your kisses. Won't you come to my arms, sweet darling?
What a great songwriter this guy is. So yeah, I think there's really great essays to be written about the deep country influence. And the Beatles are big country fans,
Ringo.
Which is strange. Right, Ringo. But, which is strange for Britain because Britain is really not a country. In Britain, country makes a lot less sense than rock and roll. But in Britain, it's very fetishized and cultish. Yeah. So they have like cowboy dances and cowboy stuff, but it's very small.
Yeah.
Right. I love that you brought country into this thing. I love that I mistook Dolly for Iris.
Had to. Well, Iris, hugely inspired by Dolly, for sure.
Totally, but they have that same bell-like clarity in their voices.
Okay. There's a couple different directions we can go here. I was thinking that it would be nice to do another rock and roll band that came right after the Beatles, or, they sort of picked up where the Beatles left off in terms of popularity. So you're a fan?
Yeah. So this is an interesting space because I'm a huge fan, but in critical terms, they don't cut it. They don't cut it. So there's this interesting. There's just a huge reserve of affection for the whole idea of Led Zeppelin and like getting off on that drumming and the tightness of the ensemble and the crispness, the musicianship. I mean, it just cuts. It's great. This record is a disaster. It shouldn't have been a double record. And they're slapping stuff on that shouldn't be on there. And they're also slowing their tempos down. I mean, this is like 73, right? They're starting to slow their tempos down and doing these 7-minute, oh my God, when is this thing over? The pretension is way out of control, way out of control. And then there's just this very basic question that critics like to ask, which is what do you have to say? And then how are you saying it?
And they have nothing
the content
to say.
and the form. They just have very little to say. Let's get laid, let's party. Like that's the beginning and the end of Led Zeppelin.
Let's read the Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, let's pretend Lord of the Rings is worth reading. I mean,
okay, and if you
I'm sorry, and like that will be a deeply offensive remark to many people.
Yes.
But I mean, really, is anyone going to argue this is serious literary? I mean, like, I'm sorry.
If you could go to one concert at Madison Square Garden
Yeah.
in 1973 or whatever, is
Yeah.
it Rolling Stones or is it Led Zeppelin?
Stones easily. So the Stones have many more interesting things to say.
Yeah.
And some of it's offensive, but the Stones are very, very interesting songwriters. They have really interesting contradictions and interesting things to say. And, it's very, the controversy over, well, I don't want to say the controversy over, but the brown sugar debate is a very interesting nexus for them. Because it was a very popular song and nobody knew what it was about. Nobody paid attention to it. But when I show my students the lyrics, oh boy. And, it's just very complicated to consider that song without being deeply offended by it. And then that song is a response to Altamont. I mean, so with the Stones, you have to deal with a very difficult, like, moral arc.
Yeah.
And I enjoy listening to that song, even with a lot of reservation. But the song, I mean, the music really works. You can't say that it's weak music. It's great music.
Back to your point about music being rock and roll being for the youth. There's probably like the core fans when they first came out were like, the Beatles suck. Like they're boring. Like this is real rock and roll. Just because it's attracting a little bit of a younger demographic. It's brash. It's loud.
Yes, I do think there's a reaction to it. A reaction to the Beatles, and Zepp is very 70s.
Yeah.
But we forget, Zepp came out in 68. The first two albums are 68, 69. The second album for me, is the one. The second album just thumps. The tension with the band is great players, and there's so little substance. Like, wouldn't it be great if they did one Dylan song? Like, can you imagine if Led Zeppelin did a Dylan song? Which one? And Jimmy Page would have great ideas about how to arrange a Dylan song. And Hendrix has everything Hendrix did of Dylan is supernaturally great, right? So I deep admiration and respect, and I get my jollies a lot from Led Zeppelin. They don't rank as high.
I think we made a good list.
This was
good argument.
This was as challenging and as mind-stretching as it's ever been. I mean, some of these questions are really worth chewing on.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I appreciate that.
Everything has been said about the Beatles, so we took a slightly different tack. And we ended up talking about a lot of other artists.
It's good to do it that way.
The Beatles in the background.
Yeah, it's good to do it that way because the Beatles are so... There's so many different portals, and there's so many different. I mean, the Beatles taught me about music history, right? They were people criticize my criticism and they say, "Oh, it's too Beatles centric." I'm like, that's fine with me. That's a perfectly reasonable place to land, and that it was definitely my core. But what did the Beatles do? They sent me to Carl Perkins. They sent me to Little Richard. They sent me to Elvis Presley. They sent me to Jerry Lee Lewis. I had to understand. I had to figure out why are they doing this material. And then I got to know that other stuff. And history started to make sense. The Beatles were, in the best way, librarians, pointing me towards all of the great source material. All right, very good. Jack, this was so much fun. Thank you so much.
Speakers are good, right?
Speakers. Yeah, I don't even want to ask what you spent on those speakers, man.
Trackstar Podcast is a presentation of public opinion created by me, Jack Coyne, Kieran Coyne, and Henry Cornaros. Produced by Haley Sobel. Edited by Haley Sobel. Theme and original composition by Kieran Coyne. Mixing by Devin Klein. Our agent is Joanna Orland at UTA. Thanks for listening. See you next Wednesday.